Today we're gonna talk about Dragon Ball, but first we need to fit the occasional more. I can't do it. I can't hit that high. And this is to go even further beyond. Much better. Now let's get this video on the road. Before his passing in 2014, I had never really read anything by Akira Toriyama. I had watched Dragon Ball Z Kai as a teenager, but felt that it was fine. Admittedly, that was probably just because I didn't want to like the same anime as all the other kids at school who had only seen Dragon Ball and nothing else. But in 2025, and partially as my journey to read every Shonen Jump manga, I decided to block out Akira Toriyama's works and finally get to reading all of them. From Dr. Slump to Dragon Ball to Sandland, boy oh boy do I have some opinions about these series. Akira Toriyama was undoubtedly an incredibly influential manga artist, but this was quite the battle of endurance at times. I can't deny the impact he had on shonen manga, but I also want to share my own opinions on the works because I definitely have some issues with them. So without further ado, let's begin with Dr. Slump, but I'll timestamp all the other series because I know like 99% of you are here for Dragon Ball, but I read them all, so I'm going to talk about them all. And also, while you're still here, subscribe for the next one. We're trying to hit 750. Dr. Slump is the first manga I've read where I have felt with such a strong intensity that I am not the target demographic for this manga, which makes sense since it's a manga for kids and I am 26. The art is very simple and slapstick, but in fun ways. I have no issues with the art, but it is really in the jokes that hamper my enjoyment of the series. Now don't get me wrong, Dr. Slump is a funny manga, but I'd be lying if I said I was consistently laughing at it. But coming at the series having seen only the Dragon Ball superhero movie, it felt like seeing the origins of Toriyama's humor that never really goes away. And by that I mean there are a lot of poop jokes, and I mean a lot of poop jokes. Which isn't inherently a problem, sometimes it is funny, but a lot of time it isn't or it kinda gets old. Which is really the case for most of the jokes in Dr. Slump. It's a comedy manga, it's hit or miss, which is to some extent the issue. But a lot of Toriyama's humor at the time has not aged super well. And as I'm sure everyone saw coming, and I will get to again later, the pervy humor is pervasive in Dr. Slump. When Senbei is not inventing silly inventions for silly chapters, he's being a pervert. And yet somehow he's still less pervy than Master Roshi, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Senbei is the crux of so many chapters, but like most of the adults besides Superman, they're a lot less funny than the children. Aureo is a joyful protagonist who is so silly but in a fun way. Her dynamics with most characters and her impossibly strong abilities are so fun. When she just casually splits the world in half because someone underestimates her because she's a kid, surely she can't just like solo every fictional character ever. But I also just like the other children in the Norimaki family. Yajiro is such a silly little guy and that's enough. I love Turbo. I don't know what it is, bro is just vibing with his superpowers. And admittedly, Fantastic Four didn't steal the superpower baby, potentially. I don't know, I didn't look too much deep in that. But it is funnier if they took it from Dr. Slump. I think the kids are generally the funnier characters in the manga, and I'm sure if I was a kid I'd be hooting and hollering for the various other things, but alas, I did not. I imagine there are videos out there dissecting the strength of comedy, but I'm just a guy, and personally I didn't find Dr. Slump funny a good bit of the time. However, I do think it gets funnier as it goes on. The batting average for the latter third or so was definitely more funny than not. But then somehow we make our way to Dragon Ball, and Toriyama somehow learns all the wrong lessons on the comedic front. Master Roshi is so bad. It's like they took Senbei's pervy nature and dialed it up to 11 and then said, let's hit 12. He should not be allowed near a woman. They should all be given free restraining orders from this threat to public safety. And unfortunately, he's so pervasive in early Dragon Ball that it really hampers my overall opinion of the series. For reference, I'm merging Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, but I am going to talk about most of Z's arc individually, so it functionally doesn't matter a ton after splitting them. I really is just as my list does it, that's how I'm merging them. Dragon Ball up until the Vegeta introduction is a story that gets better as it goes on, but it is also proportional to how much Master Roshi is involved. But there's also a clear marker of quality changes from once the series settles into the Tenkaichi Budokai formula. I think the tournaments are such a simple formula for a story arc, but it works really well. Everybody trains and gets stronger, then they fight, and the cycle repeats time and time again. Its scale is small in comparison, but it's enjoyable. And I think the small scale helps because one of my biggest gripes I'll get to later on is that Dragon Ball takes its stakes way too high where it starts to kind of lose itself. But for this series up until Vegeta, it's the small fun series that never gets too serious but is still enjoyable. And I can appreciate it regardless for its undeniable impact on the current shonen manga landscape. But it is also incredibly hampered because Master Roshi exists and is very grating. As for the introduction of Vegeta, I think it's a really solid start for Z. Vegeta is immediately engaging, and the way the series runs with him is a delight. The arc as a whole feels like a good bridge from the past into the Z that future arcs will exist in. Its scale is a decent size, but the Earth is still fine, and the stakes are more manageable without jumping into the expansive scale of later arcs. The Frieza arc is also one of the better ones, but it's really the proper change to Dragon Ball we know of today with the introduction of the Super Saiyans. Frieza is one of the best of the I am alive and therefore I must destroy villains in Dragon Ball. They're chaotic but also dead set on just causing problems. My problem with later Dragon Ball, especially Super, is that too many of the villains take from Frieza but can't hope to compare. Frieza's presence is overwhelming, but it's understandable. My brain can fathom Frieza's strength and it isn't constantly in flux in miasmic ways. But I think the more impactful part of the Frieza saga is the introduction of Super Saiyan and how Dragon Ball spends the rest of its existence making big power-ups feel like world-altering, but for the most part still understandable. Up until Ultra Instinct, Dragon Ball does power levels in a simple but effective way until it hits the ceiling and thankfully finds a new route. And Super Saiyan is such a good power-up that shows a clear power growth, but it also ties into the anger of a Saiyan. It's not just pure extra strength, it's born from strife and strong emotions. Which is the thing I like about the power system as a whole, is it's never just a strict upgrade, it is an upgrade that comes at the cost of something else, and there's a delicate balance there that is interesting. But while I do think the Frieza arc is pretty good, unfortunately for it, the Cell Saga exists and blows everything out of the water. I firmly believe that the Cell Saga from the introduction of the androids to the defeat of Cell is the best arc in Dragon Ball. Once Cell comes into existence, it is such an incredible stretch of fights that are engaging with dire stakes, but also good character moments. Cell's journey towards Perfect Cell is simple, but it feels increasingly threatening with each power-up. Each absorption is meaningful and frightening, but still grounded. But what helps this arc stand strong is its ties to past Dragon Ball, but also keeping the stakes understandable. We're not quite at galaxy-level fights that lose their weight, because the jump from planet or two being destroyed to the universe being destroyed is a lot bigger than the jumps before it. There's a scale there, and you kind of have to balance your way up, and thankfully we're still in the incremental ones and not the jump to the sky. But what I love most about the Cell arc is the Cell games, because it's just another pure and simple tournament arc. It works at keeping things grounded and allowing the characters a meaningful time to build while also giving us indirect characterization on Cell, who also just wants to fight. The plot builds to the games and then we witness them from start to finish. But I also love, and what is probably my favorite aspect on a character level of the Cell Saga, is the relationship between Goku and Gohan. My biggest gripe with later Dragon Ball is that Goku loses his focus on training the future generations to varying degrees. The meme of him being a deadbeat dad, that's admittedly my biggest issue with him. I love that the climactic moment of the Cell Saga is Goku sacrificing himself and choosing to put his faith and power into the future generations, into Gohan. It's not Goku showing he's the strongest, he goes into it knowing he's gonna die, but he has full and complete faith in Gohan and his abilities. And I think that's what's so special for Goku as a character. I think Goku does keep this understanding of power in relation to him throughout the later parts of the story, but I think it's at its peak here. He still wants to get stronger and be the strongest, but also to train the future generations and believe in the future. He isn't immortal, even if the series sometimes feels like he kind of might be. To get ahead of myself a bit, I think Super starts losing this idea to some extent because most of the arcs become the Goku and Vegeta show, where they're increasingly in step with each other, but other characters' power levels feel like they're often just caught up to speed when the story needs it. I don't hate how Goku grows in the future of the story, but I do wish that the story kept more focus on training the future generations. Goku has several kids, he should be seeing them and helping them grow, especially the two that very clearly want to be like their father. But unfortunately, all of this goes against the whole bit of Goku being an absent father. You could spend a chapter or two every so often training with your kids, man. Especially ones like Goten, who very clearly takes after his father. But at least he sees his new family members by the end of the saga. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the Buu Saga first. The Buu Saga marks a turning point in my opinion of Dragon Ball as a whole, which is that every arc starts to feel like varying degrees of just the Cell Saga, but bigger and less compelling. It's still a pretty good arc, all things considered, but I think the scale gets a bit too lofty. The Earth getting destroyed so quickly does set his power level, and it's still close enough to home that the emotional reactions of the characters work well, but it's starting at that drifting away that I'll keep talking about over and over again. I can understand why Goku is pissed all his friends are dead, but beyond this point the weight has diminishing returns. But I do love the Spirit Bomb as an idea. It's just such a fun power of gathering the world together to stop Buu instead of just Goku all in his lonesome. It's good in a different way from him training the future generations, where it's the world coming together, just putting that energy into him. And I love that stuff. You could say it's cheesy, but man, I love it. And lastly, I do like how Buu becomes this like silly guy at the end of it all. And Oob is a cool idea for a character, but feels very underdeveloped when you consider the rest of Dragon Ball. I think he has potential, but he's never really explored enough to be relevant again, except when Toriyama needs that like extra little bit of power, which maybe was something we were going to explore in the arc, but unfortunately is passing away. We will never know unless Toyotaro decides to continue it, which I will talk about later. And with that, that's the original run of Dragon Ball. Easily the peak of the series narratively, but it also starts to show the cracks in the narrative structure of the series, albeit it's not till much later that it becomes a real issue. But now onto Dragon Ball Super. The early part of Dragon Ball Super is a lot of groundwork, which is fine to me, but it also is a series that on the whole, I have very mixed opinions on. The Beerus stuff exists, and it's hard to qualify as an arc in my mind beyond what the wikis say, since it's kind of just Beerus messing about until he's like, I'm good, and then stops and becomes a side character for the rest of the time. It's not really until Goku Black where it feels like the plot begins in earnest with an antagonist who can be routed and not a god who is just kind of vibing, doing his own thing. But between reading Dragon Ball Super and writing the script after finishing it all, I'm going to keep it so real with you, I forgot Goku Black was an arc until I sat down and looked at the arcs and went, oh yeah, that was there too. I only really knew him from the memes and from Fortnite before reading it, but he's a fun arc, albeit not particularly impactful one for me, considering I forgot it happened. I think the idea of him is cool, but he just doesn't do anything for me personally beyond just being evil Goku. The colored Super Saiyan power-ups are neat, but I'm glad they start to slow down here and transition to Ultra Instinct. The progressive strength jump gets a bit too difficult to tangibly understand beyond vibes, and the trade-off levels of each one I start to lose a bit, but I can understand still. It's no Nen, like it's not difficult to understand, it just gets a bit confusing how they balance things, besides just being the blue and then the red and the color changes and goes up. But at the very least, I'm glad this arc gave us Trip Goku. And at the very least, for Dragon Ball Super as a whole, I'm glad it exists because it gave us the Tournament of Power, which is by far the best arc in Super, and up there with the Cell games in my opinion. For starters, to the surprise of no one, I like it because it's a plain and simple tournament arc. It's got a silly setup for it, but it works and makes me chuckle for various reasons. There's still stakes involved, since technically a lot of people die in it because he just erases universes, but it feels like Toriyama's just getting to throw his guys at each other while also giving us one of the best characters in the series with Jiren. And honestly, Jiren, in comparison to all the other antagonists of Super, is so surprising and so much better than any of them. He's such a nuanced antagonist who isn't really evil, but just kind of needs to be course corrected, which is such a breath of fresh air compared to all the villains who are pretty unequivocally evil. The fight between Goku and Vegeta and Jiren and everybody else isn't really one of malice, but of growth for everyone involved. Which then brings me to Ultra Instinct, which is such a great innovation on Dragon Ball's power system. Some of this is that I just love when a character gets a power-up that is them getting stronger in a different way than just their overt power level going up. Because Ultra Instinct is basically just Goku being in tune with every aspect of himself, which is so much cooler than just adding yet another step onto the Super Saiyan ladder. It's similar to things like the Transparent World or various Nen powers where it's derived from the user's understanding of themselves and the world around them. I also just like that the visual indicator for Ultra Instinct isn't anything crazy. It's still noticeably different from normal Goku, but it's more reserved, because it's more internal than it is like an external big thing. It still changes, obviously, but it's not as grandiose, but I think that works on a narrative level and is cool. Some of that is also just letting Toyotaro's style flourish a bit more on its own and allowing Ultra Instinct to have its own level of aura in contrast to Super Saiyan's iconic power-ups. And even as the arc progresses and Ultra Instinct grows and changes, it still feels sleek and like something wholly new for the series, which really impressed me. And I think if you just jump past Moro, everything about Super is fine and nothing of value is lost. But alas, I talk about Moro, that guy that I hate. Moro is such a nothing villain to me that he drags the whole arc down with him. He's arguably one of the purest evil villains the series has, but also has so much time spent on him for what basically is just what if we made Cell and Frieza, but worse. And really my biggest problem with Dragon Ball Super is how many of the villains feel like they're retreading the Cell saga in various shapes, but at a lot worse. and some arcs are able to stand up more than others, but Moro feels the most like Toriyama just running it back, but not as good. The arc is really just Moro kills everything until Goku and Vegeta level up enough to stop him, except their power up here is a lot less distinct than prior arcs. And once you get to the Granolah arc, it's them mastering their new powers, whereas here it feels like they're just kind of continuing on the path, which isn't inherently bad and is arguably necessary. It's really just that Moro is a bad villain who I don't like, who I really just wanted to be done with as soon as possible. It's an arc that crystallizes all my problems with Super into one arc. It's just Cell 2.0 with the dial turned way up without considering the headache it would give me from going that high. He just absorbs the guys, but his power is bigger, and then he's like all of a sudden at Mountain, which is a neat change. Admittedly, the Mountain, a neat little change. But when he's just absorbing guys and their powers, I'm like, sure. Can we move on now? And thankfully, Toriyama answers my prayers and returns back to a more grounded arc with Granolah. But before I talk about the arc proper, I gotta get this out of the way, because my biggest gripe with this arc is the names, which isn't really a gripe. I'm kind of just like, come on, Toriyama, you gotta try a little harder than Planet Cereal, Granolah, Gas, and like most of the names in this arc. If every time I type Granolah in the script it's auto-correcting, then we've got a problem. But besides that, I think the premise of the art is neat, and honestly I'm surprised it hadn't been done before, because how has someone not gone to the Dragon Balls and been like, hey man, can you just like make me the strongest person ever? Thanks. And then it just happens. But I also think it does a really interesting way of doing that, where it's like for now, so you could, which I guess technically means you could do it forever, but let's not think about that too hard. That doesn't really matter. But I also just really like Granolah's design, even if his name isn't my favorite. He's cool, so it's fine. But I also think the arc really shines in the backstory and the character work it gets for Vegeta and Goku. Vegeta especially has such an incredible amount of character growth in this arc that I was just astounded. He's still very much the Vegeta we know and love, but he's so mature and understanding with Granolah that it kind of just feels like he's treating him like a surrogate son. And that was awesome. And then you add on the flashback with Bardock and his connection with Goku and Vegeta, which was so heartwarming to finally feel like we were getting depth for these characters beyond just their power levels. One of my complaints with a lot of Super is that it just feels like the Goku and Vegeta show, but the Granolah arc feels like the true apex of their character arcs. They master their God of Destruction and Ultra Instinct powers and gain closure for their past in ways I never expected they would. But unfortunately, after this arc, my complaint of it being the Goku and Vegeta show is answered in the worst way possible by bringing out the B team in an adaptation of the superhero movie. For context, prior to reading all of Dragon Ball, the only Dragon Ball Super stuff I had experienced was the superhero movie, which is a movie of all time. It's campy and silly with nothing too crazy to note. It's a perfectly enjoyable filler movie, but unfortunately, it's not actually a filler movie anymore. Although it is really funny in the manga version where they have to spend a whole chapter being like, hey guys, here's Broly's whole deal, because like he doesn't technically exist here, but he's in the movie, so he's here now. My issue with the superhero arc is really just that it's an adaptation of a movie I already saw that I thought was unrelated to the manga proper. Having to re-experience an arc I didn't really care about as functionally the final arc of the series as of now was not the best feeling in the world. It just feels incredibly out of place in the manga coming off of the Granolah arc, and also just most of the cast of the movie barely being in any of Super besides as like side characters. It's a very silly Toriyama arc, and it feels more in line with things like Sandland or Koa, where it's this just like separate story if there is like a whole little adventure and stuff like that. But when you prop it up against the rest of Super, it feels very strange. It feels like a filler movie that somehow got into the manga itself, instead of just being a thing that exists alongside. And admittedly, I don't really see where the series can go for Goku and Vegeta as characters past Granolah, besides just giving them more backstory and maybe having Goku be like, you know, a father to his children. But I would have rather Toriyama dig around finding for an answer in the manga than just jumping right into superhero. Some of this is my expectations and my preconceived notions about the manga, because I didn't know that it was an arc. I didn't know superhero was real. When I saw how many chapters were left for the end, I figured we'd have one last big arc before the current end. But nope, somehow we get lost in the woods until we reach the final few chapters. Admittedly, it's hard to call the final few chapters an arc, but I think the series ends off on a pretty perfect note with Goku finally becoming a parent again after neglecting his family for like 200 plus chapters. It's cute and wholesome for what is the current final chapter. I can't speak to how much Toriyama knew about writing it as a final chapter, but it works really well as a send-off to the series and Toriyama. And honestly, I'm okay if the series ends there. Now, of course, some people are going to be like, but what about Frieza? What about new Frieza? To which I respond that, like, I honestly just don't care. I'm sure it could be a good arc, but with how much of a mixed bag and a strong final chapter we already have, I don't really feel the need to explore it any further. And while I'm sure Toyotaro could do well with it, I think I'm okay to just let the work exist as it is. If Jump wants to make another series with Toyotaro at the helm, be my guest, but I think Dragon Ball Super should end as it is. I'm open to more. If it happens more, if we get more chapters, I will read them, but I think we can let the Super with Toriyama's involvement be as it lay. And then we can continue with Dragon Ball like Frieza or whatever you want to call it. And that's Dragon Ball. Overall, there are some good and there's some real bad. If I had to rank arcs, it's probably Cell Games, Tournament of Power, probably like Buu, and then Granolah. Maybe Buu and Granolah are kind of like tied. And then you put the bottom and it's like Moro. And then at the bottom, it's Master Roshi. But for what is large part of Toriyama's work, you can see the influence of Dragon Ball everywhere. And I know that he will be remembered forever in varying capacities, whether it be through indirect inspiration or just direct inspiration from people, even as time goes on and his works are still like tertiary inspirations to people. But I think for the life he lived, he did great. He made some great manga that I have mixed opinions on, but overall I'm glad they exist, and it was a really interesting read for all of them. However, there are still more Toriyama manga to read. 2 more actually. Let's dive into those. You can kind of treat this as like the video proper ending, but also like, I don't know how many of you read Galactic Patrol Jaco or Sandland. However, for those who weren't leaving, if you want my little Goku feelings, skip to that timestamp, because I have some interesting feelings on him that aren't really centered around the arcs as a whole, as kind of just an overarching thing that I touched on in the Cell game stuff that I wanted to circle back to. But first, Galactic Patrol Jaco. I'm gonna be so for real with all of you. This was the last Dragon Ball related thing I read, and I have no strong opinions on it at all. It is a short series that exists that isn't terrible, but is also just very whatever. It's very comedic Toriyama, but it just never really vibed with me right. But it's also only a handful of chapters, so it's not like it has a lot of time to be lost by reading it all. And for the other series, we have Sandland. I thoroughly enjoyed Sandland. I think Toriyama's strengths are best encapsulated in these short, self-contained adventure manga, because it balances his comedy and his aesthetic sensibilities well without tipping too far in either direction. There's no like power systems and stuff to get lost in. You can just make the guy as strong as you want. Sandland is also kind of like Koa in that it's this short little romp that never overstays its welcome. It's fun and silly, but also a lot more mature than Koa, which is just like a kid's manga for kids, whereas Sandland has some interesting and mature themes. Like it grapples with the lasting effects of war and the profound toll it takes on everyone involved. And having a brief side part of the story where they find this supposedly extinct race of people and just are like, hey, let's leave them alone. We didn't see anything. But it's such a nice touch. But it's also one of the most interesting parts is having the characters that were affected by learning they were fighting a war for nothing and then just immediately turning heel to make a better future for everyone was so good. It's just like pure, almost childlike optimism, but it works for Toriyama because he always feels like he is a mangaka for children to really give them people to look up to without needing to be too complicated or like morally gray and things. He's a pretty clear-cut like good and bad guy, which is cool. I like it. It's such a pure optimism, but coupled with the childlike joy of characters like Bizzlebub, who feel like an aged-up character from Koa, but with a little more moral complexity to him. And it's got a quintessential Toriyama fight, so really it's all there. It doesn't have the expanse of a series like Dragon Ball, but Toriyama knows the bounds of the story and keeps them grounded while flexing his writing ability between series. And now it's time to talk about Goku. I have these really conflicted feelings about Goku that span across the series, so I'm putting them here. As has been made pretty clear with the prior part of this video, I think the Cell Saga is the peak of Dragon Ball as a series with Tournament Champions in a close second, alongside probably early Super Saiyan stuff. But between Z and Super, I feel like Goku changes as a character, or rather, the story changes him. What I really love about Z is that Goku puts his faith in the next generation of fighters to be able to fight the battles that he never could. His sacrifice and belief in Gohan to kill Cell is such a special moment that stuck with me even after not touching Dragon Ball for many, many years. It felt like a passing of the torch, or at the very least, an acceptance of faith in others. But once Super rolls around, it feels like this idea is never really brought up again in any meaningful capacity. The most he'll do is pass off to fight to Vegeta, which is not the same thematically or narratively. That's not the future generation, that's just like your buddy. I appreciate though that the story lets Gohan be a somewhat normal person considering his child experiences where he has to kill like the strongest being ever. But then you have Goten and young Trunks that very clearly take after their respective fathers and clearly want to be strong. And while I can understand Vegeta not being super willing to train young Trunks since, he's an active father in his life, Goku is very much a different story. You could probably count the numbers of days he spent with his children on one hand. It feels like they just kind of exist on the side while Goku pursues his own pinnacle of strength, and they can become like jokes to be like, man, that Goku, he's such an absent father, he hasn't seen his kids. But it doesn't feel like he ever has lost that faith in the future, but he has a much less active role in perpetuating the future, or just like in general, which in some part is because, as I've said, Super is basically just the Goku and Vegeta show for most of its existence. The other fighters get called in when Two doesn't cut it for a fight or to just show how strong a villain is. And if one of his sons is very clearly interested in getting stronger, why can we get some crumbs of just meaningful training between Goku and his children? And I can already see the, well, he's too strong to train with them argument. And to that I would say, Goku is an adult. He has so much more lived experience than all of his kids, especially in fighting. He doesn't really even need to be the one fighting in order to impart wisdom on his kids. Especially after Ultra Instinct, Goku should be teaching that in schools, since even without the need to fight, it's focusing on a completely different understanding of the self. Someone like Gohan found happiness on his own, and I'm sure so will everyone else. But I think there's room for Goku to impart his wisdom on his children about the true meaning of fighting, and that semblance of self-understanding that makes Ultra Instinct what it is. Goku isn't immortal, even if it seems like he is sometimes. Realistically, we'll never see the true passing, but there's always something important in teaching the future generations. Goku's had his ups and downs in life, and it's one of the many roles of a parent to help guide their kid to live the fullest life they can. He has fought so many strong guys and had so many things, he can impart that wisdom onto his children. And I say all of this, but I do still enjoy Goku as a character in story. I just wish he had a little more fleshing out with his character relationships and his family. After the Granolah arc felt like the perfect place to have Goku reflect on his life and engage with his children, but alas we go into the movie arc where Goku is just off fighting Vegeta for the millionth time. There's also the inkling of a chance that Toriyama was going to take Goku down the route of training his children, but due to his passing, we'll never know. But even the small piece of Goku interacting with his grandchild was such a great moment for him as a character, aside from the fact that it finally feels like he is an actual parental figure and not just pure fighting spirit. Overall, I have a weird relationship with Dragon Ball as a series, but finally sitting down and experiencing it all helped me clarify my thoughts a lot. And while I don't think it dramatically changed my opinion of the series, it made me appreciate it more at least. I like the Cell Saga much more than I did when I last saw it. I'm also adult and not a childish person who is like, I don't want to like this saga because everyone else likes it. I want to be hip and cool and hip, I'm an adult now. I've moved on from things like that. But I also still have some issues with the series. I think the humor of early Dragon Ball and Dr. Slump gets very raunchy in a way that is actively distracting to the series, and thankfully it's lessened and lessened as the series goes on. But unfortunately it never goes away, since Master Roshi is still alive. He shows up for 2 panels and you know he is harassing a woman. But in spite of all the time passing, Dragon Ball never loses its Toriyama influence, and his particular brand of humor never really goes away, with it being especially apparent in Superhero. And when it works, it works. It's great and funny. But it's also a mixed bag, like most humor. But I'll give it credit for being pretty timeless, even if it feels a bit crude to laugh at poop jokes as an adult. But hey, if it's funny, it's funny. Dragon Ball is this series that never forgets the childlike joy of shonen manga, the intense fights that push characters even further beyond, the comedy to keep things light, and most of all, the joy of just watching characters beat the daylights out of each other on increasingly grand scales. While I can't say Dragon Ball is one of my favorite shonen series ever, it lives up to its legacy as a fantastic entry point for someone. You never really need to think too hard when most of the power-ups are just a guy getting stronger or he copies other abilities. And while I still prefer more character-specific things like Nen, I can't deny the appeal of Dragon Ball's power system and its approachability. Nothing is simpler than Super Saiyan 1 going to Super Saiyan 2 and so on and so forth. While I may not have experienced a ton of Toriyama's work while he was alive, I'm grateful for his immense influence on so many of the series that I love. His influence will always loom large, even if it's less explicitly stated in the future. But who knows, maybe we'll get a new mangaka who glazes Dragon Ball like Hokuzono and Horikoshi glaze Naruto. But as a storyteller myself, Toriyama is a great example of how to write comedy in the midst of tense moments, but also a lesson in just keeping it simple. Dragon Ball is a simple series, but it's flourished that simplicity into something truly super. As for his other works, I love how Toriyama tells adventure stories. They strike this amazing balance of comedy and serious moments that still feel approachable to all ages, but also just feel like adventures. There's emphasis put on the journey, and the little detours happen along the way while still moving things forward without feeling like the journey is starting to come to a halt to do those little side adventures. His influence is undoubtable, but after reading so many of his works, I can truly understand just how good he is at what he does. He's a true legend of manga and one whose influence will never be forgotten.